That brings us beautifully to one of the things that was really interesting to me in the book was the discussion of the four stages of a currency, basically. That the cycles of money. Was it four stages of currency? I believe it was, right?
Maybe you know this book,
The fourth
Turning.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask about.
And the funny thing is, the fourth turning, these four cycles, they're basically always lagging the monetary cycles for a few decades behind. So basically, four money cycles always precede these cycles. And 100 years ago, Argentaris said that basically such a minor or major, but a monetary crisis happens to a society roughly every 100 years, or whenever the last generation who witnessed it is gone. And it's crazy that he wrote this basically almost exactly 100 years ago.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would point at 2008 as being that crisis, but it sounds like you think that we're still yet to approach like what the actual, what that crisis might be.
I mean, it's a long crisis. One thing that allows people to get away with devaluing a currency for so long is that the effects have years and decades delay, and the worst effects have sometimes a generation delay. So basically, a generation that makes the error is not the generation that suffers the consequences, which is why it's so hard to learn from it. And basically, the only thing that really prevents us is the people that witness monetary crisis saying, no, don't do that. We did that once, that hurt. And whenever that generation is gone, that knowledge is gone, basically. That's the lesson. And if you look at it, it's eerie because really there's smaller cycles that basically go devalues, and then there's a crisis and there's one, and then there's bigger cycles with actual fiat money, but there's a variation to the cycles, but these 4 generational cycles are really, you can really very well correlate them to historic events, and they always go hand in hand with monetary cycles. For I would say causal reasons. So I think there's a good argument to make that is not just correlation, but actually causation.
So what would you expect to come soon in this end of in the fourth turning, basically? What would you think that we are going to be looking at? Just like economic collapse?
Crazy thing is, we never before in human history had a world economy on pure fiat money. That never happened. So it's hard to predict how it will play out. You can say some things about what will happen to the capital stock, what will happen to society, but you cannot really say when it will end and how bad it will get, because the one major factor that ends normal paper currencies is that they basically trade with other nations that have a gold standard, or the bimetallic gold-silver standards market. And basically that limits how much that nation can do in shenanigans. Because this is something that in the second book of this 4-part series in Valuta, Argentaris describes very well how these dynamics work. But now we have paper currencies competing with paper currencies. And as long as basically the dollar is the leading currency, all the other countries that trade in the dollar, that are hooked up to the euro-dollar system, need to just print slightly faster than us. If they print slower, they basically, all the prices, the interest rate currency shoots up, as it happened to Switzerland. And that's really bad for their own exports. And if country prints too fast, then it happens like Zimbabwe, Argentina, Venezuela, they just go into hyperinflation. But as long as all the others stay printing at slightly faster pace than the US, that game can theoretically go on. Unless people at some point say, hey, wait a second, we just had a bailout where you printed 1000x the GDP. We don't tolerate that anymore. But it really takes a lot for people to actually not only catch on broadly, but actually take action against such a deflation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of the times like discussions about money are very abstract. Like it's difficult for people to grasp. It's like I ask a lot of economists and people I talk to about this, like, what is money? And they give me long, detailed, like very philosophical answers. And if I just ask someone on the street, they'll just be like, it's what I pay for things with.
That's the crazy thing. It's actually pretty easy, which Antares proved 100 years ago, but it's part of what keeps the system running, that ordinary people don't know it. And
no one teaches me, like it's not something that.
Do you know Rahim Tait Sadegan?
No.
He came originally from Iran, lives in Austria, or I think he moved to Switzerland, but lived for a long time in Austria, and basically was the biggest Austrian economist in Austria in this century, and or is still, just not in Austria anymore. Like so many other Austrian economists, he left Austria, and he explained in a very, very nice book, so the basics of Austrian economics. And what he wrote is that essentially the reason in Austrian economics there's such a hard time is that there's not a real industry for economists. Really, the main job of an economist, or the main market for economists, is writing paper for governments and central banks to buy. And these papers obviously have to affirm the central bank. And it's quite hard. I mean, even Argentarius in his book about the central bank, only between the lines was able to write that it's completely nonsense. In the end said, yeah, maybe there's some place for a central bank, because he couldn't at the time, especially as a converted Catholic but born Jew in Germany in the 1920s, he simply couldn't say, no, sorry, central bank is complete nonsense, you have to abolish it. He had to dance around that concept, even though he very, very clearly implied it in his books. He couldn't say it out loud, and that's really the issue, that the job of an economist is not to explain the economy, but it is to actually justify whatever the leaders want justify.
Yeah, that's a very nice and also horrifying way of putting it. Do you think what you said there about other governments need to print money maybe just a tiny bit faster than America, basically, is that why this policy of quantitative easing has spread so far? Is that why there's like so many developed nations are just taking part in that, just money printing?
But I mean, in the end, to really discuss this, we would have to go into the inner workings of the euro dollar system, which has nothing to do with the euro. It's much older than the euro, but that, I think, really explaining that takes several hours. But in a nutshell, it goes back to what Antares explains in valuta. Every transaction is ultimately settled in goods and services. Money is just a medium of transaction. Basically, besides a drug deal where you really exchange the money and the good directly at gunpoint, it's not possible to do transactions with the person at the time, most of the time. So you need a way to postpone a transaction in time, place, and often person. And that's really in the end what the money is. How to build a money that does that very well and how to evaluate it is another topic. But essentially, money is just a tool for postponing transactions. And so if you think in the moment you get a dollar bill or a euro bill or a gold coin that you have been paid, that's false. What you really need to think about is, when I spend that, will it buy me the goods that I want now, or would it be better to barter right now? And basically, if you say, in my grandfather's generation, they were still very common in the rural parts of Bavaria, that actually the employees of a landowner lived in his house, worked the fields, and they didn't get really paid. They got housing, they got food, and they were allowed to sell a portion of the produce they produce for their own benefit at the market. So what many of these people didn't realize when they switch later on, especially for simple grants by the government, when they switched to being paid in money, they didn't really think about, would that paper money actually buy them the same housing, the same food, the same fair money for drinking at the pub or whatever, than the previous agreement with their owner did. And what happened in Germany, what was so devastating, is that basically with the aftermath of World War One, it didn't. So and then World War Two again happened, and basically each generation had a complete reset of their purchasing power, and they didn't get anywhere really until the late 50s and 60s. And the stark thing is that so many people get fooled by that idea and sell themselves poor, even skilled businessmen. So this is what happened in 1923, that people basically, he describes it with a perfume store owner where he wants to buy a gift for his wife. And basically the man gets angry when he asks to buy the perfume. He says, I won't sell that because last week I sold all my bottles and now my store is only half full because I couldn't even stock up again. That's the price had risen so much. And I mean, in a hyperinflation, you see it because you notice, okay, I sold last week so many bottles. And now with the paper profits I made, I can still buy less bottles than I could buy last week. But when inflation is slower, it's much harder to notice that.
Hey everyone, thanks for making it right the way to the end of the podcast. I love that you tuned in this long. Do me a favor, hit subscribe, because 80% of you bastards are not subscribing, but you're watching my videos. See you next time.